The next morning, having dismissed his host's offer of an early shoot with the casual cruelty of a man whose mind was elsewhere engaged, Wimsey descended to the servants' hall at a deliberately unfashionable hour. Neither breakfast nor elevenses, but that peculiar interval when household staff believed themselves momentarily unobserved. He carried with him a notebook of elegant proportions, a fountain pen that had cost rather more than was strictly defensible, and an expression of elaborate disinterest calculated to disarm those who might otherwise have regarded his presence as threatening. Mrs. Henworth received him with the wariness of a woman accustomed to protecting her domain from intrusion, though she offered tea with the mechanical courtesy of one whose training superseded her inclinations. Wimsey accepted, observing as he did so the precise arrangement of the servants' hall, its austere furnishings, the small window that overlooked the disputed laundry line, and the clock on the mantelpiece which, he noted with the satisfaction of a man finding exactly what he had anticipated, ran approximately 4 minutes slow compared to the pocket watch he consulted. The housekeeper, confronted with gentle inquiries about the household's routine, proved a repository of information both useful and extraneous. Cassandra Vall, she explained, with the disapproving tone of a woman discussing a distant relative of questionable breeding, had been in service for 14 months. She had been competent in her duties but unpopular with the other servants, inclined to airs, and suspected of reading novels in her room when she ought to have been mending. More significantly, Mrs. Henworth added, lowering her voice with the conspiratorial manner of one imparting genuine scandal, there had been an understanding between Cassandra and young Jessup. Nothing scandalous, you understood, but the sort of attachment that might have encouraged indiscretion. When Wimsey inquired, with apparent casualness, whether Cassandra had received visitors, Mrs. Henworth's expression underwent a subtle but pronounced alteration. She had, she admitted after a brief hesitation, received a gentleman caller on 2 occasions in the past fortnight. A gentleman, though Mrs. Henworth's inflection suggested considerable doubt regarding his claim to the title, who had arrived by motor car and remained for approximately an hour on each visit. The butler had observed him, though his description had been vague, dark-haired, possibly 40 or thereabouts, well-dressed but with something not quite right about his manner. He had given his name as Mr. Ashton and had asked specifically for Cassandra. This intelligence proved sufficiently interesting to justify Wimsey's presence in the servants' hall, though he concealed his interest beneath a veneer of polite distraction, asking instead about the laundry arrangements with the thoroughness of a man unusually concerned with domestic hygiene. The routine, it emerged, was invariably the same. Mondays and Thursdays witnessed the washing, with items hung to dry on the line by 7:30 in the morning. The previous week's Wednesday drying had been removed by 10 o'clock, and Thursday's washing had been hung precisely at 7:30 on the morning in question. Cassandra's body had been discovered at approximately 11 o'clock by the second housemaid, Sarah, whose shrieks had alerted the entire household to the tragedy. The doctor, summoned from the village, had arrived at noon. The body had been cold, suggesting several hours. Exposure to death, though the precise timing remained uncertain. Rigor mortis was ambiguous under the circumstances, and the temperature of the West Wing lavatory, which possessed an external window and a somewhat primitive heating apparatus, complicated all estimates. What intrigued Wimsey particularly was Mrs. Henworth's account of the morning itself. She had personally hung the laundry, she insisted, beginning at 7:30 and completing her task by 8 o'clock. She had not noticed anything amiss at that hour, though she acknowledged that the linens obscured much of the yard from her vantage point. At 8:30, when she had begun to collect items from Thursday's drying, the previous load, now thoroughly dried by the morning sun, she had discovered that 3 items were missing. She had assumed initially that they had been taken by one of the maids, though no one had admitted to moving them. The police had inquired thoroughly, she said, and nothing had been resolved. Inspector Thorne had seemed inclined to suspect the wind, despite the evident calm, and Mrs. Henworth had not contradicted him, being disinclined toward further complications. Wimsey set down his teacup with precision, and observed that the weather that morning had indeed been remarkably still. He had, in fact, inquired of the village postman regarding meteorological conditions. He then inquired, with the gentle persistence of a man pursuing a particularly elusive thought, whether Mrs. Henworth had noticed anything unusual about Cassandra's demeanor in the preceding days. The housekeeper's response was instructive. Cassandra had seemed, she said, both anxious and anticipatory, as though awaiting something she simultaneously dreaded. She had asked twice about her evening off, normally a matter of indifference to her, and had received several letters, unusual correspondence for a housemaid, which she had carefully concealed. Most tellingly, she had mentioned to Sarah that she was considering her situation, language which Mrs. Henworth interpreted as a prelude to either resignation or some unspecified change in her circumstances. Wimsey, having extracted this information with the delicate persistence of an archaeologist brushing away centuries of accumulated dust, rose to his feet and thanked the housekeeper with genuinely felt gratitude. As he departed, notebook in hand, he paused at the threshold and inquired, apparently as an afterthought, whether either of the missing pillowcases had borne any identifying marks. Mrs. Henworth's response, a pause, a hesitation, a correction, suggested that one had indeed been marked with initials not belonging to the Colonel's household. Wimsey's investigation of young Jessup occupied the better part of the afternoon, though not in the manner Inspector Thorne had undertaken his own interviews with that young man. Where the inspector had employed the blunt instrument of accusatory questioning, Wimsey adopted the tactics of a man genuinely interested in equestrian matters, which happened to be the groom's acknowledged expertise. They met in the stable yard, where Jessup was engaged in the therapeutically dubious activity of polishing an already immaculate saddle, and Wimsey opened their conversation not with inquiries regarding Cassandra's death, but with a lengthy disquisition on the relative merits of various saddle makers, a topic upon which Jessup proved unexpectedly knowledgeable. Only after establishing this cordial common ground did Wimsey permit the conversation to drift, with apparent artlessness, toward Cassandra herself. The young man's response was instructive, genuine grief mingled with resentment, affection complicated by something approaching anger. He had cared for her, he admitted reluctantly, though he had been beginning to suspect that she did not care for him in the manner he had hoped. She had seemed preoccupied of late, distracted, as though her thoughts were perpetually elsewhere. He had attempted to discover the source of her anxiety, but she had deflected his inquiries with the practiced evasion of someone harboring secrets. Most significantly, Jessup revealed that he had not in fact been present at breakfast on the morning of Cassandra's death. He had been sent by the head groom to attend to a horse that had gone lame at a neighboring property, a task that had occupied him from 6 o'clock until nearly 10. The neighboring groom could corroborate his presence, though Inspector Thorne appeared to have dismissed this alibi with a cavalier attitude of a man convinced of guilt regardless of inconvenient facts. Wimsey, listening to this account with an expression of sympathetic interest, observed that the inspector seemed to have confined his investigation to those individuals present at the manor, rather than pursuing the more laborious methodology of verifying the movements of those apparently absent. This observation, delivered without rancor, appeared to produce a curious effect upon young Jessup, a subtle relaxation, as though a burden he had been carrying had been marginally lightened. When Wimsey inquired, with careful casualness, whether Cassandra had mentioned any gentleman caller, Jessup's response was immediate and bitter. Yes, there had been someone, a man in a motor car who had appeared to regard Cassandra with proprietary interest. Jessup had been jealous, he admitted, and had questioned her regarding the stranger's identity. Cassandra had refused to discuss the matter, declaring it no concern of his, words which had provoked their most serious quarrel, occurring, Jessup specified, approximately a week before her death. This intelligence proved sufficiently substantial to merit further investigation, and Wimsey departed the stable yard with a vague promise to Jessup that he believed the young man's difficulties would soon be resolved, a statement which appeared to unsettle the groom considerably, suggesting as it did that matters were rather more complicated than simple suspicion of romantic rivalry. The vicarage occupied that particular species of location favored by ecclesiastical establishments, too distant from the village to be properly integrated into its social structure, yet too close to escape its scrutiny entirely. Reverend Thornbury proved to be one of those clergymen possessed of the perpetually harried expression of a man perpetually surprised by human nature's capacity for sin, an expression which intensified noticeably when Wimsey inquired whether his wife had known Cassandra Vole beyond the limited acquaintance which parochial duty demanded. Mrs. Thornbury, summoned from an adjacent room with visible reluctance on the part of her husband, offered an explanation which was simultaneously vague and remarkably specific. Cassandra had attended church with reasonable regularity, had seemed a quiet, respectable girl, though perhaps inclined toward excessive worldliness in her reading habits and correspondence. When Wimsey inquired, in his most innocent manner, whether Mrs. Thornbury had observed the gentleman caller who had visited Cassandra on several occasions, the vicar's wife underwent a peculiar transformation. Her careful composure fractured entirely, and she confessed, with the desperate urgency of someone unburden themselves of guilty knowledge, that she had recognized the visitor. He was, or had been, some years prior, a resident of the village, a man of considerable charm but questionable character, who had left under circumstances which suggested haste rather than planning. His name had been Edmund Ashford, though apparently he had adopted the assumed name of Ashton for his recent visits. The revelation produced an atmosphere of considerable tension within the vicarage study, and it became evident to Wimsey that the Thornburys harbored a secret of their own regarding this mysterious visitor. After delicate negotiation conducted with the finesse of a man accustomed to extracting information from reluctant sources, Mrs. Thornbury reluctantly divulged that Edmund Ashford had, in his previous incarnation as a village resident, been engaged to marry the daughter of a local family, a girl named Eleanor Bracken, who had subsequently married instead a much wealthier gentleman from Surrey. Ashford had vanished from the village within a fortnight of the wedding, and his subsequent history had remained unknown to the parish until his recent reappearance. The vicar and his wife, bound by pastoral discretion, had said nothing to the colonel regarding this ghost from the past. But now, confronted with Cassandra's death and this visitor's connection to her, they found themselves uncertain whether their silence had been merely prudent or actively culpable. Wimsey, absorbing this information with the serene detachment of a man contemplating a puzzle whose pieces were beginning, at last, to assume suggestive patterns, thanked the Thornburys for their candor and departed the vicarage, with his mind engaged upon calculations of timeline, motive, and the rather intriguing question of what a man like Edmund Ashford might want with a housemaid, unless, of course, he wanted something through her rather than from her. The question of what Edmund Ashford might want occupied Wimsey's thoughts as he walked through the village toward the railway station, where the station master, a man of legendary garrulousness, proved perfectly willing to discuss the arrival and departure of motorists passing through. The parish. Ashford, it transpired, had arrived on the Monday preceding Cassandra's death, driving a hired automobile from London. He had taken lodgings at the Crown and Anchor, a respectable if undistinguished establishment, and had made 2 journeys to Brackenstall Manor during his stay. The station master had observed his departure on the morning of Wednesday, the morning of Cassandra's death, though the motor car had departed empty, Ashford having apparently remained at the inn, or so the station master had assumed, though upon reflection he acknowledged that he could not actually testify to having observed Ashford himself after Tuesday evening. This gap in observation, trifling as it appeared, struck Wimsey as worthy of investigation. He therefore directed his steps toward the Crown and Anchor with the purposefulness of a man pursuing a promising line of inquiry. The innkeeper, Mrs. Hartley, proved less forthcoming than the station-master, though her reluctance appeared to stem less from discretion than from a general disinclination to discuss her guest's movements with what she clearly perceived as an inquisitive stranger. However, when Wimsey casually mentioned that he was assisting the police in their inquiries, a statement which, while technically imprecise, produced the desired effect of lending his questions an air of official authority, Mrs. Hartley became considerably more cooperative. Ashford had occupied the corner room on the first floor, she said, the one overlooking the High Street. He had dined alone on Monday and Tuesday evenings, had seemed nervous and distracted, and had received a visitor on Tuesday afternoon. A woman, though Mrs. Hartley could not identify her beyond noting that she had been young and had worn dark clothing. The visitor had remained for approximately 1 hour, and Ashford had seemed considerably agitated following her departure. Ennui. Wednesday morning, Ashford had not appeared for breakfast, which Mrs. Hartley found odd given his previous regularity. She had knocked upon his door at 9 o'clock, receiving no response. When she had entered the room using her key, she had discovered it empty, the bed unslept in, though Ashford's travelling case remained. She had assumed he had gone for an early walk and had thought no more of the matter until the evening, when his absence had become more obviously problematic. By that time, police inquiries regarding Cassandra's death had begun, and Mrs. Hartley, piecing together various village gossip, had become increasingly uncertain whether Ashford's departure had been deliberate or whether something more sinister had transpired. This intelligence, when combined with the information already gathered, suggested a scenario of considerable complexity. Edmund Ashford appeared to have vanished on the morning of Cassandra's death, leaving behind his luggage and, apparently, his immediate plans. The woman who had visited him on Tuesday remained unidentified, though Wimsey harbored an increasingly specific suspicion regarding her identity. What intrigued him particularly was the precise timing of events. Cassandra's death occurred on Wednesday morning, sometime between 7:30 and 11 o'clock. Ashford's departure from the inn appeared to have taken place during precisely that interval, and the missing laundry items suggested that someone had required cloth of sufficient size and opacity to conceal something, or someone, from casual observation. Wimsey therefore took the liberty of examining Ashford's abandoned room, a task facilitated by Mrs. Hartley's willingness to overlook the technical impropriety of his investigation. The room itself yielded little of obvious significance. The travelling case contained evening dress, underclothing, and toiletries, all suggest of a man, anticipating a prolonged stay. However, the wastebasket contained a torn envelope, the fragments of which, when reassembled with patience and a certain amount of speculation, revealed an address in Kensington and a notation of £300, a sum substantial enough to suggest business of considerable importance. Upon his return to Brackenstall Manor, Wimsey found that circumstances had undergone a subtle but pronounced alteration during his absence. Inspector Thorne had returned, bearing news that Edmund Ashford had been located, or rather that a body matching his description had been discovered near the railway line approximately 3 miles from the village. The body had been identified by Mrs. Hartley as matching Ashford's appearance, though identification was complicated by the fact that the body had been partially decomposed and bore signs of having been struck by a train. The discovery had occurred early that morning, though the body had presumably lain there since Wednesday. Inspector Thorne appeared to regard this discovery as somewhat inconvenient, as it complicated his simple theory regarding Jessop's guilt, while simultaneously providing a solution to the mystery that required no further investigation. Ashford had murdered Cassandra in a fit of rage, had subsequently fled in panic, and had met his death through either suicide or accident upon the railway line. The case, in the inspector's estimation, was now effectively closed. However, Wimsey observed with polite but persistent inquiry that the timing seemed somewhat problematic. How could Ashford have struck Cassandra in the lavatory and simultaneously been absent from the inn for the entire morning? And more significantly, what possible motive could connect a man she had only recently encountered to such violence? Inspector Thorne, disinclined toward complications, suggested that such matters were often irrational, and that his theory, while perhaps not perfect, was at least sufficient for purposes of closing the investigation. Wimsey, maintaining an expression of serene courtesy, suggested only that perhaps one ought to examine the matter rather more carefully before allowing it to rest. He then excused himself with vague mentions of fatigue and proceeded to the library, where he spent the remainder of the evening in consultation with the Bracken family's collection of correspondence, seeking something which he had by now become almost certain must exist. The library at Brackenstall Manor occupied that peculiar species of architectural space favoured by Victorian gentlemen of moderate intellectual pretension. Shelves of leather-bound volumes arranged with more regard to aesthetic uniformity than scholarly purpose, interspersed with the accumulated detritus of a family's correspondence spanning several decades. Colonel Bracken, discovering Wimsey engaged in this examination, expressed mild surprise at his guest's apparent interest in domestic documentation, but offered no impediment to the investigation. It was, in fact, Colonel Bracken himself who provided the crucial clue, albeit inadvertently, by remarking upon Wimsey's particular focus upon letters dated to the period approximately 8 years prior. That was when Eleanor had married, the Colonel observed with the casual tone of a man discussing a matter of negligible importance, though his wife had seemed somewhat distressed by the affair at the time. The engagement to young Ashford had been broken quite abruptly, some difficulty regarding his prospects, he believed, though Eleanor had never been entirely forthcoming regarding the specifics. His own financial situation had been considerably more robust, and he had been prepared to offer marriage, which Eleanor had accepted with apparent alacrity. They had been reasonably content, though Eleanor had never quite lost a certain wistfulness which he occasionally detected in her expression when she believed herself unobserved. This revelation, delivered with the obliviousness of a man unaware that he had just provided the keystone to an arch of considerable complexity, sent Wimsey's thoughts spiraling into new configurations. He therefore contrived, through the delicate manipulation of polite conversation, to engineer a circumstance in which he might speak privately with Mrs. Eleanor Bracken. She received him in the morning room, a space rendered deliberately feminine through the agency of chintz and watercolor paintings, and presented an appearance of composure so rigidly maintained that it appeared almost pathological in its precision. When Wimsey inquired, with the gentleness of a man broaching a subject of considerable delicacy, whether she had known Edmund Ashford during her younger years, her response was tellingly slow in arriving. Yes, she admitted finally, she had known him. They had been engaged. The engagement had been terminated due to circumstances which it would be indelicate to discuss. She had subsequently married the Colonel, and had endeavored to put the past entirely behind her. More recently, and here her composure underwent its first perceptible fracture, she had been contacted by Ashford through an intermediary. He had indicated that he possessed certain documents which might prove embarrassing to her and her husband, and that he was willing to suppress these documents in exchange for a considerable sum of money. She had refused his initial demand, but Ashford had persisted, and the matter had become increasingly difficult to manage. It was at this juncture that Cassandra Vole had entered the equation, Mrs. Bracken explained with the careful articulation of one recounting a narrative she had men. Tally rehearsed extensively. Ashford, frustrated by Eleanor's continued refusal, had apparently befriended the housemaid, how or through what means Eleanor could not determine, and had attempted to manipulate her into providing access to Eleanor's personal correspondence. Cassandra, it seemed, had initially been willing to assist, but had subsequently developed a crisis of conscience. She had attempted to warn Eleanor of Ashford's scheme and had offered to recover any documents he might have obtained through her assistance. Eleanor, alarmed and humiliated by this exposure of her private shame, had agreed to pay Cassandra a sum of money in exchange for her silence and assistance. However, Cassandra had then committed what appeared to Eleanor to be an act of unforgivable betrayal. She had written to Ashford threatening to expose his blackmail scheme to the authorities unless he immediately ceased his demands and departed the village. This letter, Eleanor explained, had been discovered by Eleanor herself when she had searched Cassandra's room following the maid's death, discovered, in fact, before the constabulary had conducted their own investigation. The implications of this confession began to settle upon Wimsey with the weight of carefully positioned stones. He therefore inquired, with meticulous courtesy, what Eleanor had done upon discovering this letter. She had panicked, she admitted. Ashford had already departed the inn, or so she had believed, and she had feared that Cassandra's interference might provoke him to some desperate act of retaliation. She had gone to Cassandra's room early on Wednesday morning, intending to recover the letter before it could be discovered by the police. She had found Cassandra in the lavatory, washing her hands with the ritualistic deliberation of someone engaged in an act of compulsive cleansing. Eleanor had demanded the letter. Had Beck. Ohm, increasingly agitated when Cassandra had refused to surrender it, had grasped the girl by the shoulders in an attempt at intimidation, and then Cassandra had pulled away, had stumbled backward, and had struck her head upon the porcelain edge of the wash basin. It had been an accident, Eleanor insisted, her voice now barely above a whisper. Merely an accident. She had panicked, had realized that no one would believe her account, and had fled the lavatory. She had spent the remainder of the morning in a state of profound distress, and when the alarm had been raised regarding Cassandra's death, she had maintained her silence, hoping desperately that the matter would be resolved without her involvement becoming apparent. The missing laundry items, she explained in response to Wimsey's pertinent inquiry, had been her own desperate attempt to create a distraction, to obscure the morning's timeline. She had collected them while pretending to assist Mrs. Henworth, had concealed them in her room, and had subsequently burned them. She had hoped that the mystery of the missing items would confound the investigation sufficiently to prevent careful examination of the morning's precise sequence of events. Wimsey listened to this confession with an expression of sympathetic attention that concealed, beneath its surface courtesy, a mind engaged in rapid reassessment of the entire narrative structure he had constructed. However, there remained certain elements which refused to cohere with Eleanor's account, certain inconsistencies which suggested that her confession, while containing a substantial foundation of truth, was fundamentally incomplete. He therefore rose to his feet with deliberate slowness and posed a series of seemingly tangential inquiries regarding the precise timing of Eleanor's morning activities, the specific location of the lavatory in relation to the servants' queue, orders, and most significantly, the question of whether Eleanor had in fact possessed the knowledge necessary to recognize that Cassandra had been contacted by Ashford. Eleanor's responses, while carefully considered, began to betray the strain of a narrative maintained through conscious effort rather than memory. It was at this moment that Wimsey permitted himself a thin smile and observed, with the delicate precision of a man correcting a grammatical error, that her account contained several elements which appeared to have been constructed after the fact rather than experienced contemporaneously. The missing laundry items, for instance, would have required considerable forethought to collect and conceal, yet Eleanor's own description suggested that she had acted in a state of panic immediately following Cassandra's death. The reconciliation of these two contradictory emotional states seemed, to Wimsey's mind, insufficiently accounted for in her narrative. Eleanor's expression underwent a profound transformation, and she sank into the nearest chair with the air of a woman whose carefully constructed facade had suddenly collapsed. She then revealed, in a voice reduced to a whisper barely audible above the tick of the mantelpiece clock, that her confession had been incomplete. The truth, she explained, was considerably more complicated and considerably more damning. She had not, in fact, been present in the lavatory when Cassandra had died. She had gone to Cassandra's room early that morning, had found the letter regarding Ashford's blackmail scheme, and had demanded that Cassandra accompany her to the lavatory, ostensibly to discuss the matter privately. Once there, Eleanor had attempted to persuade Cassandra to destroy the letter and to cease all involvement in the affair. Cassandra, however, had proven unexpectedly resolute. She had declared her intention to deliver a letter to the constabulary herself, to expose Ashford's criminality, and to accept whatever consequences her own involvement might entail. She had, moreover, expressed her conviction that Eleanor's moral cowardice in submitting to blackmail was substantially more reprehensible than Ashford's criminal extortion. These accusations, delivered with the righteous certainty of a young woman convinced of her own moral rectitude, had produced in Eleanor a reaction of extraordinary intensity. In a moment whose duration she could neither precisely specify nor adequately explain, she had seized a heavy porcelain pitcher from the lavatory's washstand and had struck Cassandra upon the head. The confession hung in the morning room's carefully cultivated silence with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. Wimsey absorbed this revelation with the calm detachment of a man encountering precisely what his deductions had indicated must be true, though the conscious mind had been attempting to resist the conclusion. He then posed a series of methodical inquiries regarding the events subsequent to Cassandra's death, how Eleanor had concealed the crime, how she had managed the discovery of the body, and most pertinently, what had become of the letter which had precipitated the entire chain of events. Eleanor's responses, now apparently stripped of the compulsion to construct protective fictions, were surprisingly forthright. She had immediately retrieved the letter from Cassandra's pocket, had destroyed it, and had departed the lavatory while maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy sufficient to avoid immediate suspicion. She had spent the subsequent hours in a state of dissociation, engaging in her ordinary morning activities with the mechanical precision of an automaton. When the alarm had been raised regarding Cassandra's death, she had feigned shock and dismay with a facility born from desperation. The missing laundry items had indeed been her own contribution, an attempt to introduce confusion into the timeline that might prevent precise determination of the hour of death. However, and here Eleanor's voice took on a quality of desperate urgency, she had not acted entirely independently. Her daughter, Margaret, aged 16 and staying at the manor during the school holidays, had observed Eleanor returning from the lavatory in a state of evident disturbance. Margaret, possessed of a young woman's acute perceptiveness, had immediately deduced that something of considerable significance had transpired. Eleanor, terrified that her daughter's knowledge might betray her, had confessed the entire matter to Margaret, extracting from her a promise of absolute silence. Margaret had subsequently become the architect of the laundry deception, suggesting to her mother that the introduction of temporal confusion might serve to protect them both from discovery. It was Margaret who had suggested removing the pillowcases and napkin, Margaret who had advised Eleanor to conceal her distress beneath the veneer of ordinary domestic activity, and Margaret who had each subsequent day counseled her mother regarding the necessity of maintaining absolute silence. The woman who had visited Ashford at the Crown and Anchor on Tuesday afternoon had in fact been Margaret herself, acting upon her mother's instructions to ascertain whether Ashford remained genuinely engaged in his blackmail scheme or whether he had departed the village. This addition to the narrative produced in Wimsey a moment of genuine philosophical pause. The complicity of youth in the concealment of a mother's crime suggested dimensions of moral complexity which extended considerably beyond the immediate legal questions of culpability and motive. He therefore rose to his feet and observed. Ed, with the neutral tone of a man stating an objective fact, that the situation had progressed somewhat beyond the range of his own capacity for discretion, and that he would, regrettably, be compelled to communicate his findings to the appropriate authorities. Eleanor's response was not, as might have been anticipated, one of despair or denial, but rather a peculiar species of relief, as though the burden of maintained deception had become sufficiently onerous that its removal, regardless of consequence, represented a form of liberation. Wimsey's communication of his findings to Inspector Thorne occupied the better part of an hour, and proceeded with all the delicate precision of a man attempting to explain the intricacies of classical architecture to someone equipped only with the vocabulary of basic geometry. The inspector's initial response was one of profound skepticism, his mind having already achieved a state of comfortable resolution regarding Ashford's guilt and subsequent suicide. The introduction of Eleanor Bracken's culpability, therefore, represented not merely a complication, but a wholesale rejection of the narrative upon which he had constructed his entire investigative conclusion. However, the presentation of Eleanor's own confession, coupled with Margaret's corroborating account of the laundry deception, ultimately forced upon the inspector an acknowledgement of the case's true character. What remained uncertain, and what occupied Wimsey's thoughts with particular intensity, was the precise nature of Edmund Ashford's death and the timing of his departure from the village relative to Cassandra's murder. The constabulary's investigation into Ashford's demise revealed that the body discovered near the railway line had indeed been formally identified as Edmund Ashford through examination of personal effects, and subsequently confirmed through fingerprint comp. Arison, with records maintained by Scotland Yard regarding a conviction for fraud dating to some years prior. However, the precise circumstances of his death remained ambiguous. The railway surgeon's examination indicated that Ashford had been struck by a train sometime during the early morning hours of Wednesday, though whether this had occurred before or after his departure from the Crown and Anchor proved impossible to determine with absolute certainty. What proved considerably more interesting, from Wimsey's perspective, was the discovery among Ashford's personal effects of a railway ticket indicating that he had, in fact, purchased passage to London on Wednesday morning, suggesting an intention to depart the village rather than to remain and persist in his criminal extortion. This intelligence suggested that Ashford, confronted with Cassandra's threat to expose his scheme to the authorities, had elected to abandon his blackmail attempt and to flee rather than to face potential prosecution. He had therefore departed the Crown and Anchor at an hour early enough to ensure his arrival at the railway station well before Cassandra's appointment with Eleanor in the lavatory. The question thus became one of determining the precise sequence of events on that crucial Wednesday morning, and it was here that Wimsey's interrogation of Margaret Bracken produced results of singular significance. The young woman, confronted with the knowledge that her mother had confessed to Cassandra's murder, underwent a transformation of remarkable completeness. She abandoned entirely the protective posture she had initially adopted and provided a detailed account of the morning's events, which, while not fundamentally altering Eleanor's confession, did introduce certain elements of timing which suggested that the discovery of Eleanor's crime had not been entirely accidental but rather the prod of Margaret's own deliberate investigation. Margaret, she explained, had observed her mother leaving the lavatory at approximately 7:30 in the morning, had noted Eleanor's evident disturbance, and had, through a combination of youthful intuition and adolescent audacity, proceeded to investigate. Upon discovering Cassandra's body, she had not immediately raised an alarm but had instead spent several crucial minutes examining the scene of the crime with the methodical attention of someone far older and considerably more experienced in criminal investigation than her years would ordinarily suggest. It was Margaret who had first recognized that the positioning of Cassandra's body appeared inconsistent with a simple fall, and it was Margaret who had, with impressive sang-froid, concealed the blood-stained pitcher in the coal scuttle before discovering her mother in the morning room and extracting from her the full account of what had transpired. This revelation introduced into the case an entirely unforeseen dimension of psychological complexity. Margaret's subsequent actions, her communication with Ashford, her orchestration of the laundry deception, her maintenance of absolute silence regarding her mother's crime, suggested a young woman possessed of capabilities and motivations which extended considerably beyond simple filial loyalty. When Wimsey posed to her certain inquiries regarding her own feelings toward the murdered housemaid, Margaret's responses became notably guarded. She had not particularly liked Cassandra, she admitted, though she had harbored no active animus toward her. More significantly, she had been profoundly disturbed by what she perceived as Cassandra's self-righteous moral judgment of her mother. Cassandra, in Margaret's estimation, had represented precisely the species of self-deceiving sanctimoniousness which characterized so much of contemporary middle-class morality, the conviction that one's own rectitude justified the destruction of others, the belief that abstract principles superseded the claims of human affection and familial obligation. In refusing to destroy the letter, in threatening exposure, Cassandra had, in Margaret's view, forfeited any claim upon human sympathy. The girl's death, while regrettable, had therefore appeared to Margaret as a natural consequence of her mother's confrontation with blackmail, rather than as a discrete criminal act warranting external intervention. This perspective, articulated with a sophistication and emotional detachment that appeared almost pathological in one of Margaret's years, produced in Wimsey a moment of profound philosophical disquiet. He found himself confronted not with a simple case of maternal violence followed by filial concealment, but rather with the far more disturbing scenario of a young woman who had, through a combination of circumstance and deliberate choice, become complicit in the construction of an elaborate deception, whose purpose was not merely to protect her mother, but to perpetuate what Margaret perceived as a justified elimination of a moral transgressor. The implications of this perspective, the suggestion that a 16-year-old girl possessed both the capacity and the conviction to view a human death as morally acceptable, suggested layers of psychological disturbance which extended well beyond the immediate criminal matter and touched upon questions regarding the nature of moral development in individuals possessed of superior intellects but diminished emotional constraints. Wimsey therefore found himself considering, with increasing discomfort, whether the legal resolution of this case would in fact constitute justice or merely the suppression of a far more unsettling truth regarding the human capacity for rationalization in service of deeply held convictions. The legal proceedings that followed proceeded with all the relentless machinery of English justice, grinding toward its inevitable conclusion, though the machinery itself appeared uncertain regarding precisely which conclusion ought to be reached. Eleanor Bracken was formally charged with manslaughter, the Crown's prosecutors having determined that the circumstances, while constituting an undeniable act of homicidal violence, lacked the premeditation necessary to support a charge of murder. The distinction, a matter of considerable legal significance but negligible practical import, suggested a crime of passion rather than calculated malice, a categorization which Eleanor's counsel exploited with considerable effectiveness in mitigation. Margaret, by contrast, occupied a far more ambiguous legal position. She had not herself committed the act of violence, nor had she compelled her mother to do so. She had, rather, engaged in a series of deliberate actions designed to obstruct the investigation and to conceal the perpetrator's identity, crimes in themselves, yet crimes whose severity was complicated by her youth, and by the fact that the concealment had been undertaken in service of familial obligation, rather than personal benefit. It was during the interval between Eleanor's commitment for trial and the actual commencement of proceedings that Wimsey received, through Colonel Bracken's mediation, a request for a private interview with Eleanor. The meeting took place in the prison's visiting room, a space rendered deliberately institutional through the agency of minimal furnishing and the perpetual presence of warders maintaining discreet but absolute surveillance. Eleanor presented a figure transformed by the weight of legal consequence and the dissolution of the protective illusions which had previously sustained her. She bore upon her person the peculiar exhaustion of one who has, through confession and confrontation, been stripped of the comfortable self-deceptions upon which her former life had depended. When she addressed Wimsey, her voice carried a quality of desperate urgency, as though she feared that the window of opportunity for communication would close before she could adequately articulate what she perceived as necessary for him to understand. She began by acknowledging that her actions had been inexcusable, that no circumstance could justify the taking of a human life, and that she understood perfectly well the magnitude of what she had done. However, she wished Wimsey to comprehend certain aspects of her situation which she believed he might otherwise overlook in his inevitable preoccupation with the narrow legal facts of her crime. She had spent the better part of a decade in a state of psychological bondage, she explained, perpetually vulnerable to the resurrection of a past which she had hoped to have successfully buried. Ashford's reappearance had transformed abstract dread into immediate concrete threat. She had not possessed the fortitude to resist his extortion through legal means. She had not possessed the courage to confess the nature of her past to her husband, and she had therefore submitted to a form of psychological slavery whose daily accumulation had eroded her capacity for rational judgment. Cassandra's intervention, undertaken, Eleanor acknowledged, with genuinely altruistic intention and moral conviction, had paradoxically precipitated the very catastrophe which it had been designed to prevent. More significantly, Eleanor wished Wimsey to understand the precise nature of the moment in which her crime had occurred. She had not, she insisted, deliberately planned violence. She had gone to the lavatory with the intention of persuasion, of appeal to Cassandra's better natu. Of somehow convincing the girl that discretion and silence represented a superior moral choice to righteous exposure. But Cassandra had been immovable, had lectured Eleanor upon the necessity of honesty and the purifying effects of public confession, had essentially informed Eleanor that her suffering was deserved and that genuine redemption required the destruction of everything she possessed. And in that moment, confronted with the full force of Cassandra's moral certainty, Eleanor had experienced something approximating what might be described as psychological rupture, a moment in which the accumulated weight of years of fear, humiliation, and powerlessness had crystallized into action. The seizure of the pitcher, the strike against Cassandra's skull, had emerged not from premeditation, but from a species of emotional explosion whose violence had shocked Eleanor as profoundly as it had devastated its recipient. Wimsey listened to this account with an expression of judicial neutrality, though his mind engaged itself upon the question of whether Eleanor's description represented genuine psychological insight or merely post hoc rationalization designed to generate sympathy for her impending trial. The distinction, he recognized, might ultimately prove immaterial to Eleanor's legal fate, yet it possessed considerable significance regarding the broader questions of culpability and moral responsibility which the case had introduced. He therefore posed to Eleanor a series of inquiries regarding her daughter's involvement in the subsequent concealment, and Eleanor's responses suggested a woman grappling with profound maternal ambivalence. She loved Margaret, she stated, loved her with an intensity that transcended the ordinary attachments of parentage. Yet she had also come to recognize that her daughter possessed psychological characteristics which departed significantly. Why from conventional normalcy? Margaret's capacity for detachment, her tendency toward moral abstraction, her facility for constructing elaborate justifications for actions that most individuals would regard as indefensible. These traits had existed long before Cassandra's death, but the crisis had permitted their full emergence and development. Eleanor feared, she confessed to Wimsey with visible difficulty, that her daughter might be experiencing a form of psychological disturbance which no legal proceeding could adequately address, and which might, in the absence of proper intervention, lead Margaret toward further actions of an equally or perhaps even more disturbing character. She had therefore requested this interview specifically to ask whether Wimsey might, in his capacity as someone possessed of both legal knowledge and demonstrated psychological acuity, recommend means by which Margaret might receive professional assessment and potential therapeutic intervention. Eleanor acknowledged that her request placed Wimsey in an awkward position regarding his obligations to the investigation, but she believed, or perhaps hoped with desperate intensity, that his evident intelligence and humanity might incline him toward consideration of Margaret's welfare, alongside purely legal considerations of culpability and punishment. Wimsey departed the prison in a state of contemplative abstraction that persisted through the drive back to Brackenstall Manor and extended well into the evening hours, during which he occupied himself with the composition of a lengthy letter to a physician of his acquaintance at St. Thomas's Hospital, a specialist in disorders of psychological development whose discretion and intellectual sophistication had previously proven invaluable in matters requiring both clinical expertise and diplomatic finesse. The letter, composed with considerable care and deliberation, outlined the essential facts regarding Margaret Bracken's psychological characteristics while meticulously avoiding any suggestion of formal accusation or legal involvement. Rather, it presented Margaret's case as one warranting professional assessment from a purely clinical perspective, with the implicit understanding that Eleanor's request had been motivated by genuine maternal concern rather than by any attempt to manipulate the course of legal proceedings. Wimsey's correspondence with this physician had, in the past, occasionally produced remarkably useful results in situations where conventional legal remedies proved inadequate to address the underlying human complexities with which they were ostensibly designed to contend. It was therefore with a certain degree of philosophical resignation that Wimsey received, some 3 weeks subsequent to Eleanor's commitment for trial, an invitation to dinner at the vicarage. The occasion, Reverend Thornbury explained with evident discomfort, was undertaken at the express request of Colonel Bracken, who wished to discuss certain matters of delicate importance regarding the ongoing legal proceedings and their implications for his family's future. Wimsey accepted the invitation with the wariness of a man anticipating an encounter designed to test his own capacity for moral compromise, though he attended nonetheless, dressed in evening clothes and armed with the defensive weaponry of conventional civility. The dinner itself proceeded with all the strained politeness of a social occasion constructed around the unspoken acknowledgement of catastrophe. The food remained largely unconsumed, and the conversation circled cautiously around topics of negligible significance until the withdrawal to Reverend Thornbury's study provided the opportunity for more substantive discussion. Colonel Bracken, once privacy had been secured, addressed Wimsey with the directness of a military man unaccustomed to the refinements of social circumlocution. He wished to understand, he explained, whether there existed any possibility, however remote, that the circumstances surrounding Cassandra Vol's death might be construed in a manner which would permit Eleanor's legal case to be presented in a fashion more favorable to her defense. The question itself was phrased with sufficient delicacy to avoid overt suggestion of bribery or legal manipulation, yet its intent remained abundantly clear. The colonel, while acknowledging the fundamental gravity of Eleanor's actions, believed that his wife's crime had been committed under circumstances of extraordinary psychological duress, and that a skilled defense counsel might reasonably argue that the provocation offered by Cassandra's moral judgment constituted legal mitigation of considerable magnitude. He wondered, therefore, whether Wimsey might be willing to provide testimony regarding the psychological dimensions of Eleanor's state of mind at the moment of the crime, testimony which might serve to contextualize her actions within a framework of understandable, if not justifiable, human response. Wimsey's response to this proposal proceeded with all the measured courtesy of a man declining a favor which he simultaneously recognized as genuinely motivated by affection and desperation. He informed the colonel both the request itself and the conviction regarding Eleanor's state of mind which had prompted it. However, he must be candid in his assessment that the introduction of psychological testimony regarding Eleanor's mental state would, in the current legal climate, likely prove disadvantageous rather than beneficial to her defense. Courts, he observed, remained largely skeptical regarding psychological evidence, and a defense predicated upon Eleanor's emotional disturbance might well suggest to jurors a degree of uncontrollability which the prosecutor could exploit far more effectively than the defense could defend against. More significantly, and this was the point which Wimsey approached with considerable circumspection, he had become convinced through his investigation and subsequent conversations with Eleanor that her crime, while undoubtedly born from psychological crisis, had possessed an element of deliberate choice which she herself had subsequently come to recognize. Eleanor had not struck Cassandra in a moment of genuine automatism or psychological rupture. Rather, she had consciously selected violence as a response to moral pressure, had acted upon that selection, and had subsequently constructed elaborate narratives of emotional compulsion in order to avoid confronting the full magnitude of her own moral agency in the act. The colonel's expression underwent a subtle but pronounced alteration upon receipt of this assessment, and Wimsey perceived in that alteration the moment at which paternal loyalty began its inevitable collision with the requirement for intellectual honesty. The colonel, despite his evident affection for his wife, was a man of sufficient intelligence and moral precision to recognize that Wimsey's analysis possessed substantial validity. Moreover, the colonel appeared to possess the rather unusual capacity to distinguish between his legitimate desire to protect Eleanor from the full legal consequences of her crime and his deeper obligation not to corrupt the legal process itself through the introduction of spurious evidence or misleading testimony. After a prolonged silence, occupied only by the ticking of the study clock and the muted crackle of the fireplace, the colonel inquired whether Wimsey believed that Eleanor's conviction and the subsequent legal disposition of her case would prove ultimately beneficial to her or to their family as a whole. Wimsey, recognizing in this question a genuine plea for honest assessment rather than comforting deception, provided his honest opinion that Eleanor's passage through the legal system, while undoubtedly painful and humiliating, might ultimately prove less destructive to her psychological integrity than would the alternative of successful concealment. The maintenance of a facade, he suggested, imposed a continuous burden of psychological supervision and self-deception, which could only increase in weight as time accumulated. Confrontation with legal consequence, while immediately devastating, offered the possibility of genuine transformation and the opportunity for Eleanor to reconstruct her identity upon the foundation of acknowledged rather than concealed guilt. Eleanor Bracken's trial commenced on a Monday in November, when the weather had acquired that particular quality of English autumn bleakness. Grey skies suspended low above an equally grey landscape, the entire world rendered in shades of ash and charcoal. The courtroom itself possessed the peculiar architecture of English justice, designed to emphasize the gravity of legal proceedings through the agency of dark wood paneling, high ceilings, and the perpetual surveillance of various official personages positioned to observe and record the testimony of those brought before the bar. Eleanor, appearing in the dock attired in black, and bearing herself with the quiet dignity of one who had passed beyond the point of attempting to manipulate the impressions of others, submitted to the legal machinery with a composure that appeared to stem less from confidence in her defense than from a fundamental acceptance of the justice of her own condemnation. The prosecution's case proceeded with all the methodical precision of a legal argument designed to establish facts rather than to generate emotional response. The timeline of events, the physical evidence, the medical testimony regarding Cassandra's injuries, all presented with the detached professionalism of those whose obligation was to the facts rather than to any particular outcome. The defense counsel, a gentleman of considerable skill named Hartridge, undertook his obligation to Eleanor with the understanding that the presentation of an aggressive defense would serve only to undermine her credibility before the jury. Instead, he focused his efforts upon the establishment of extenuating circumstances and the demonstration that Eleanor's crime, while constituting an undeniable act of violence, had been precipitated by pressures of such magnitude that ordinary individuals might reasonably have experienced similar psychological rupture. He called to the witness stand the vicar, who provided testimony regarding Eleanor's previously exemplary character and her evident distress during the weeks preceding Cassandra's death. He called the colonel, who testified to Eleanor's generally temperate nature and the particular psychological crisis which had preceded the crime. Most significantly, he called a physician, not the specialist in psychological disorders whom Wimsey had contacted, but rather a more conventional medical practitioner who provided testimony regarding the physiological manifestations of extreme emotional stress and the manner in which such stress could precipitate impulsive, violent behavior in individuals not otherwise disposed toward such conduct. The prosecution's rebuttal focused with considerable effectiveness upon the question of Eleanor's premeditation and deliberate concealment of her crime. The prosecutor, a gentleman named Ashford, a surname which provoked in Wimsey an involuntary moment of darkly ironic amusement, advanced the argument that Eleanor's careful destruction of evidence, her calculated deception of the authorities, and her orchestration of the laundry line confusion all suggested a mind functioning with sufficient coherence to demonstrate consciousness of guilt and deliberate intention to evade legal consequence. The fact that Eleanor had committed violence in a moment of emotional crisis, he argued, did not eliminate the intentionality inherent in her subsequent actions. Moreover, the prosecutor called to the witness stand Margaret Bracken, whose testimony regarding her mother's state of mind in the hours and days following Cassandra's death revealed an individual capable of conscious reasoning and deliberate strategic calculation rather than one overwhelmed by emotional disturbance. Margaret's testimony, delivered with the calm precision that had previously impressed and disturbed Wimsey, suggested a woman, or rather a young woman barely within the threshold of adulthood, whose psychological responses to her mother's crime had been characterized by rational analysis rather than emotional shock. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty of manslaughter, a determination which appeared to represent a compromise between those jurors inclined toward conviction on the more serious charge and those persuaded by the defense's arguments regarding extenuating circumstances. Eleanor received the verdict with the same composed acceptance she had maintained throughout the proceedings, and when the judge, donning the black cap with the ceremonial solemnity the law required, proceeded to pronounce sentence of 5 years' imprisonment, she accepted this determination, as though it represented nothing more significant than an observation regarding the weather. The sentence, while substantial enough to ensure that Eleanor would not emerge from imprisonment in the prime of her remaining years, fell considerably short of the maximum penalty which murder conviction might have produced. Whether this represented a triumph for the defense or merely a manifestation of judicial mercy remained a matter of perspective and interpretation. What interested Wimsey particularly, and what occupied his reflections during the departure from the courtroom, was not the verdict itself, but rather the manner in which the legal system had processed and resolved a crime whose true complexity extended far beyond the narrow company. Confines of criminal culpability. The law had determined that Eleanor Bracken was guilty of manslaughter, that she bore responsibility for Cassandra Voll's death, and that imprisonment represented the appropriate consequence for her actions. These determinations were, within their own sphere of operation, unquestionably just. Yet, they were also fundamentally incomplete as representations of the actual moral reality which had generated the crime. Eleanor's guilt was real and undeniable, yet it existed within a context of psychological manipulation, blackmail, moral judgment, and the complicated dynamics of maternal devotion, which the law possessed no adequate vocabulary to address. The victim, Cassandra Voll, had been presented throughout the trial as a simple innocent, a housemaid murdered without cause or justification. Yet Cassandra had also been an individual possessed of her own capacity for moral judgment, her own conviction regarding the righteousness of her actions, and her own unwillingness to recognize that abstract principle might not supersede the claims of human suffering and familial obligation. Wimsey recognized, with the clarity that comes from sustained observation of human nature in its most complex manifestations, that Eleanor's conviction and imprisonment would not restore Cassandra to life, would not genuinely transform Eleanor into a different or better person, and would not prevent similar crimes from occurring under similar circumstances in the future. What it would accomplish was the reassurance of society that criminal violence had been identified, punished, and accordingly removed from circulation, a reassurance that possessed psychological value for the community, even if it possessed no genuine value for anyone directly involved in the tragic sequence of events which the crime had generated. Wimsey departed the Old Bailey with the air of a man who had attended a particularly tedious social obligation and was grateful to have discharged his duty with minimal injury to either his conscience or his reputation. He had, at no point during the trial, been called upon to testify, a circumstance which he regarded with undisguised relief, recognizing as he did that his evidence would likely have served only to complicate matters without substantially altering the eventual outcome. The afternoon being yet young and London offering its customary abundance of diversions, he directed his steps toward his club, where he occupied himself with the perusal of a recently acquired edition of Jacobean dramatic literature and the consumption of a particularly excellent port. It was during this interval of ostensible leisure that Bunter approached with a telegram, delivered not to the flat but to the club itself, and bearing the postmark of the village from which he had so recently departed. The message, characteristically terse and unsigned, consisted merely of the words, "Margaret requests meeting. Matter of some importance. Friday next, 3 o'clock, the tea rooms. She will recognize you." The communication possessed all the hallmarks of having been composed by someone of considerable intelligence, attempting to convey urgency while maintaining the appearance of casual arrangement. Wimsey's response to this summons proceeded not through any sense of obligation to the Bracken family, but rather through the conviction that Margaret's psychological trajectory had become sufficiently interesting to warrant further observation. He accordingly found himself, on the appointed Friday, seated in the modest tea rooms which the village possessed, awaiting the arrival of a young woman whose motivations had proven considerably more complex than her youth would ordinarily suggest. Margaret, when she appeared, bore little resemblance to the G.I.R.L. he had previously encountered. The intervening weeks had produced in her a visible transformation. Not a diminishment of her earlier composure, but rather a kind of crystallization of it into something approaching genuine self-knowledge. She took her seat with the deliberation of someone conscious of making a statement through her physical comportment, and she proceeded, without preamble or social nicety, to address the purpose of her summons. She had been, she explained, undergoing a period of intensive psychological assessment and treatment with a specialist physician, an arrangement which she acknowledged had been undertaken at her mother's instigation, but which she had come to regard as increasingly valuable. The physician, she indicated, had suggested to her that she might benefit from a conversation with Wimsey regarding certain aspects of her own psychological development, and the manner in which these characteristics had manifested themselves during the crisis which had culminated in Cassandra's death. More specifically, Margaret wished Wimsey to understand that her own complicity in her mother's concealment of the crime had not been motivated, as she had previously suggested, by abstract moral philosophy regarding Cassandra's righteousness. Rather, she acknowledged with visible difficulty her actions had been driven by a considerably more disturbing motivation. She had experienced, upon discovering her mother's crime, a sensation of profound intellectual exhilaration. The commission of violence, the subsequent concealment, the construction of elaborate deceptions designed to confound the investigation, all of these elements had provided her with a species of psychological stimulation which she recognized, with the clinical detachment her physician had endeavored to cultivate, represented a significant deviation from conventional emotional response. She had, in essence, become fascinated by the mechanics of crime and concealment in a manner which transcended ordinary intellectual interest and approached something more akin to pathological absorption. The psychology specialist had suggested to her that this fascination, combined with her considerable intellectual capacity and her apparent absence of conventional moral affect regarding the suffering of others, might place her at significant risk of engaging in her own criminal behavior at some future point unless she undertook systematic work to develop what the physician had termed effective competence, the capacity to recognize and respond appropriately to the emotional and moral dimensions of human suffering. Wimsey listened to this account with attention considerably more focused than he had anticipated providing, and he found himself confronted with a young woman who had achieved, through professional intervention and personal effort, a degree of self-knowledge and psychological honesty which most individuals never attained. Margaret had, in effect, recognized and acknowledged the existence within her own psyche of precisely the psychological characteristics which he had previously suspected, but which she had been both unwilling and arguably incapable of recognizing during the immediate aftermath of her mother's crime. What impressed him most significantly was not merely her acknowledgement of these characteristics, but her apparent genuine desire to modify her responses and to develop the capacity for conventional moral affect, which her natural psychology appeared to lack. She had not come to him seeking absolution or legal assistance. Rather, she had come seeking what might be described as philosophical counsel, validation that the effort she was undertaking to reshape her own psychological responses was not merely possible, but worthwhile. Wimsey provided to Margaret company, counsel which, while neither particularly original nor particularly profound, appeared to possess considerable significance for the young woman who received it. He suggested to her that the genuine measure of moral development lay not in the possession of natural emotional responses, but in the conscious decision to modify one's behavior in accordance with principles of human decency, despite the absence of such natural responses. He observed that history was littered with individuals possessed of precisely the psychological characteristics which Margaret had acknowledged in herself, and that the distinction between those who had employed such characteristics toward destructive ends and those who had channeled them toward constructive achievement lay primarily in the realm of conscious choice and deliberate effort. Most significantly, he assured her that the very fact of her recognition of her own psychological deviance and her willingness to undertake arduous work to ameliorate its most destructive manifestations suggested that she possessed capacities for moral development which her natural inclinations might otherwise have rendered inaccessible. The conversation concluded with the understanding that Margaret would continue her work with the psychological specialist and that she would endeavor to translate her intellectual understanding of human suffering into something approaching genuine, empathetic response. Wimsey departed the tea rooms with the conviction that Margaret Bracken, despite, or perhaps because of the psychological peculiarities which had rendered her complicit in her mother's crime, possessed a genuine possibility of achieving a form of moral development which many more conventionally constituted individuals never attained.